that, but just with old-fashioned Sunday, I do think it's appropriate just to kind of have a different topic that we'll be looking at for next week. So we'll go ahead and look at Genesis. I'm hoping to get through the next two, so we'll see how fast I can preach this. I do have quite a bit of material to go over, but we'll hopefully get through it. So I guess a good question is, why am I looking at this? And especially because it is a fairly long series of what I'm planning on going through this. Well, first of all, I think that it's very practical in terms of the worldview is very contrary to the Christian biblical worldview on this topic. But the next point is it's very culturally relevant. And it's not that there's only two perspectives or two viewpoints on this. It's not like creation and like biblical creation and then evolution are the only ideas on this topic. I mean, obviously there are other religions and other ideas that are taught there. But predominantly in America, this is pretty much what we're dealing with. You either get evolutionists on one side that believe that there's no God, or you pretty much get people that believe more or less the Bible accounts. So, and again, that's more or less why we're looking at this topic, and especially in such detail. Now, as I've given my testimony before, I'm not going to go super far into that, but, I was an atheist that did believe in evolution. I'm sure many of you were also taught evolution in public school and so forth. Something that, I've seen from my personal life and also discussing with other evolutionists and things like that. First and foremost, there's no hope with the viewpoint of evolution at all. There's no hope. I mean, honestly, this is a very hopeless worldview because you're basically here by accident. You have no reason to exist. And again, I think that people that have that worldview are many times more angry, more depressed, more anxious about certain things than I would say Christians are. But, again, that's not the only reason I wouldn't say to be a Christian or anything like that. But obviously, I do think that is, for myself, what motivated me to start looking. But one thing that you'll find many times is this anger. I don't really fully even understand that, even as a former evolutionist. But I do notice this speaking to people that believe in the theory of evolution. There's a very much an anger, especially towards God. And I think that that's probably the root of it, is that they don't want to obey to God. They don't want to submit to God. Because if evolution is not true, then the question becomes, well, what is? Mm-hmm. And again, because creation from a biblical perspective is the predominant, I guess you could say, other perspective of how we came to exist, many evolutionists don't want to admit that because they don't want to submit themselves to God. So, and again, I know that there are probably other, origin stories and things like that. But again, in America, that's primarily what we're facing with. So again, that's why we are taking the time to look at those topics as well. But, for myself, again, just to kind of, not to say that I represent all evolutionists or anything like that, but, I've noticed that people that are not looking for God are very, very hard against God. It's not like there's a softness or a tenderness or anything like that. Usually evolutionists have a very fixed mentality. It's a very, I would say, deceived mentality. And I've met this from other people that have religious ideas too. Catholics can be very hard-hearted. Jehovah's Witnesses, especially people that have been very indoctrinated in those faith systems, can be very hard-hearted. But for myself, when I was going through that period of looking for God, and ended up getting saved after probably about a 2-month period there, I was genuinely asking questions that had never been really resolved or answered properly. Now, I believe that there were periods in my time, at times in my life, that I could have gotten saved if people had simply had answers. Now, I went to basically a meeting, if you want to call it that, at a restaurant with a man that had studied evolution and creationism and different things like that. And, I had a list of questions. I had a little pad of paper that I pulled out and had maybe 20, 25 questions on it. And I wish I had saved that paper because, I don't remember all of the things that I was concerned about asking. I know that Noah's flood was on there, some basic things about, species and things like that. And we'll look at some of those things here today. But, I've come across this kind of sense with a lot of evolutionists until they start to ask the questions themselves. There's very much a pride problem that is really preventing them from being open to the gospel. They're arrogant. They're very self-conceited, I want to say. They want to prove that their perspective is right and that you're wrong. And they're not open to other perspectives. Again, I'm not saying everybody is like that, but just from what I have seen, many people that go down that evolution path are very much, I would say, brainwashed in a religious viewpoint. And I don't believe that evolution is scientific. I think that there are elements of science in it, just like I would say Catholicism, it has elements of Christianity in it, but it's not Christianity. And evolution also has elements of science in it, but it's not really truly science. When you start digging in and looking at what those things mean and how you can prove those things or not prove them or whatnot there. But again, we're looking here first at what the Bible says. And again, I'm a fundamentalist, which means that I believe the Bible as literally as possible. So I'm not taking these things allegorically. I'm not taking it as some sort of a metaphor. There are, other groups of Christians that do believe those things. Evangelicals and things like that might be a little bit more open to a less literal interpretation of the Bible. But, to me, I think you're just setting yourself up for failure if you start to open up and say, well, this might be, millions of years, and maybe God just sort of was like a watchmaker that just kind of started getting things ticking and then used evolution there. I mean, I really think that that's going to be a contradiction, not only with what God's Word says, but it's also going to ask, well, how literal should we take the rest of the Bible? If the first couple chapters of the Bible are not meant to be literal, is the rest of it meant to be figurative? Are we supposed to just take Jesus as a figurative story? Did Jesus even exist? I mean, where do we draw the lines if we start to allow that to creep in? So to me, I think the safest and most logical way to approach the Bible is to believe it as literally as possible, unless it's clearly figurative. Like when Jesus says, I am the door. He's not literally saying, I am a door. He is saying, like, I'm the way to go to something. I'm the entry to go to a place of heaven. So again, we need to be careful about that. Yes, I do understand there's poetry and things in the Bible. But again, for my interpretation of the book of Genesis, I don't believe that this is millions or thousands of years. This is happening in a 6-day period. And last week we looked at the first day. So we're going to go ahead and hop into verse number 6 here. And the Bible says, and God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Now, I'll stop right there because it's the end of the sentence, but also because there's a vocabulary word that we probably are not that familiar with. The word firmament, it simply means heavens, or as I would like to think of it more as atmosphere. That would be really probably more the application of what we would see, but it really means more loosely the heavens, or heaven, if you want to call that the sky or something along those lines there. But again, I'll read that so that you can kind of put that definition in there. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Now, what is it talking about? Dividing waters from the waters. Well, we've already seen division happening in the creation story. In verse number 4, it says, and God divided the light from the darkness. So there's already division taking place here, but we already have seen that there were already waters that were there. In verse number 2, the Bible says, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Now again, we don't have all the details about where these waters were, where they came from. I mean, it was part of the creation there. But on day 2, God is doing something with the waters. And in the midst of the waters, that means in the middle of the water, he's dividing it. He's pretty much separating the water from the water. Now, I know that's kind of a hard concept for us to understand, but again, I mean, God is able to do things. I don't know if it's a liquid or a solid or a gas, because obviously God created all of the elements and the ways that they're found in nature, the laws of nature, and God's doing this in a supernatural way. So again, I don't exactly know how he did it. The Bible simply says he did it. And we don't really have all of the details about how all of those things came down. But, I would say really this is something, again, we don't have all of the details here, but it's been theorized that as God was making the world, he's basically separating a water that's on the face of the earth that we eventually will call the sea or the ocean. And he later on does describe that a little bit more. And then what I would say is pretty much like a wall of ice around the world. And we'll probably look a little bit more into that theory about why I would say that once we get to the the evolution part of the argument, the debate. But again, first we're just trying to understand what the Bible itself is saying. So again, this would be basically like a wall of ice that would be around. I would say essentially, I don't exactly know the height of it, but it's not that crazy to think about, because first of all, we have clouds in the air, and pretty much making like a greenhouse, essentially, is what that's going to be doing. So it's going to allow light to penetrate into the greenhouse of the earth, but it's also going to create sort of an atmospheric situation there, where there's a higher amount of atmosphere, which is going to allow certain things to happen. And again, I don't want to get too much into it, but first of all, it's going to make things grow bigger. So I'm already kind of leading into that, to explaining some of the things that we're going to be seeing and the questions that maybe we have. Where do the dinosaurs and all of these giant things come from? Giant ferns and giant plants that we see in fossil history and things like that. Well, there's very good reason to believe that that was partly because of how the atmosphere was set up differently. Now, again, this would have been destroyed because of the Noah's flood and things like that. When that happened, God allowed it to rain for the first time. But until then, the Bible is very clear that there was no rain. There was like a mist or a dew that sort of came up from the ground. And then again, we don't have all of the details because the earth system does not work that way. Again, when the flood happened, a lot of things changed. So again, kind of keep that in mind. But again, this is before all of those things were happening. So I'm not kind of bouncing around chronologically here, but again, this is something that hopefully we'll look at in a little bit more detail once we have the TV and things working here. But again, this is basically the atmosphere that God is making. Again, as I would argue and think, as there's a wall of water. It might be clouds, perhaps, but again, I think it's answered a little bit better by being ice that is eventually sort of like the clouds and things like that we have there. But again, going back to verse number 6, it says, let it divide the waters from the waters. So again, this would be waters that are on the earth from waters that are in the sky or in the firmament, which is the atmosphere, essentially. So there's two different parts to the water. So it's two areas, in the sky or in the firmament and on the earth, essentially. So verse number 7 says, and God made the firmament, so that's again the atmosphere, the heavens, the sky, if you want to say that, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. So again, there's a division from the upper waters and the lower waters. And again, I wouldn't exactly call it the sea yet because God hasn't formed that, but he will be forming that shortly. But there's a difference of where the waters are located here in the atmosphere and in relation to the earth. Verse number 8 says, and God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. So again, the day begins at the nighttime and it ends at the next sundown, essentially. Where again, this is before the sun was made, but at the end of when that period would be. So again, beginning at the darkness and ending at the light, essentially. So God calls that heaven. So again, we'd say that that's the sky, the firmament, and so forth that's there. So again, I know that I can't really go into a whole lot of details with that, kind of getting into some of the answers and things like that, but we'll just kind of go with that for now. That basically, again, as I'm kind of describing, there's a separation of water, sort of at the cloud level, I would say, and then now we have like a sky or atmosphere that's created. It's not just outer space. And I didn't mention this before, but there are essentially three heavens in the Bible, which we call as the heaven where God lives or resides. We can't go there. It's impossible. The second heaven would be outer space, which of course we can send spacecraft and whatnot there. And the third heaven, which we would call the atmosphere, which, how high is that? Well, I would say this is the third heavens right now. I mean, anything that's the air, you can touch it, the wind that's moving. I mean, it's all within that layer of the atmosphere, which would be the third heavens there. And again, I would say probably, roughly where the outer space begins, more or less, how we would think of that. That's pretty much where the distance of the first and second heavens would be. So continuing on here, like I said, we're going to try to get through more than just one day here. And I know, again, I didn't probably do enough justice to that, but we'll probably dig into some of those things a little bit more detail later on. But verse number 9 says, and God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and gathered together of the waters called he seas. and God saw that it was good. So again, now this is where the waters really are taking shape more. And again, this is an interesting thing too to kind of keep in the back of our mind, because God has not made mountains and things like that. The earth is not how you and I would know it, like North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Australia, all these things like that. So, and again, I think this is important for us to understand, because really when God flooded the earth, there was a huge change. I mean, the earth went through dramatic changes very quickly. And, there's reasons I believe for that. I don't believe in an old earth. I don't believe that the earth is millions and billions of years old. I believe that God created everything, and all of these things happened probably 6,000 to 12,000 years ago. Again, based on the timelines of what God gives to us and things like that. I wouldn't say it began on, July, 25th or whatever of some year. I mean, that's kind of foolish to me, but, within probably 6,000 to 12,000 years, I would say sometime in that timeline. Now, is that possible for all these things to happen? I mean, how did the Grand Canyon get made in that amount of time? I mean, you look at the Colorado River, and I've stood there at the edge of the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon, and I mean, if you're looking at it from an evolutionist perspective, you're like, wow, it took millions of years for this to happen. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Why I believe that there's reasons why that happened very quickly. And I think that there's evidences that we've seen even in our recent history that we can look to that would give us reason to believe that huge geological events like that could happen very quickly in a matter of hours or days at the very least, or perhaps a week or so, very, very quickly. Now again, as God had created all of these things, it talks about the division of the earth from the waters, and now there's a sea that's there in verse number 10. But again, keep in mind that there's no mountains formed. There's no Rocky Mountains. There's no Mount Everest. There's no Himalayas or the Andes or any of these kind of mountains and things like that. Because, again, the Bible is very clear during Noah's flood about the height of the water. And the Bible is very clear that the entire earth was covered at that height as well. So it's not very tall at all. And again, based on different metrics, because again, I would argue that probably the measuring system was a little bit different than what we would use today. I have some different reasons for that, but more or less, it couldn't have been very tall, let's say that at the very least. But definitely tall enough to flood, to cover all of the things that were there. Again, the earth at the time was not with mountains and things like that. So again, I know it's hard for us to really imagine how that happened. But again, with the flood, huge changes happened very, very quickly. So again, just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. But there's no mountains at this time. It's pretty much more or less flat, maybe perhaps hilly, something like that, how God is making this. But there's definitely a sea. There's definitely the earth. And again, I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself again on the timeline. But where is the Garden of Eden? It got destroyed. It was under the flood. So, I mean, we can't go back and, people are like, well, where did this happen? Where did that? No, it's gone. The flood destroyed a lot of things. God rearranged things. God made things very different after that. So, again, God is describing how it was at the time. And again, it will lead into the Garden of Eden, as you all would know there. But again, the earth, even at this time, as God's describing, it was quite different than what we would know it to be today. So, keep that in the back of your mind so that as well. But verse number 11 says, and God said, let the earth bring forth grass. Oh, excuse me, where am I? Okay, verse number 10. Let me just go back here a little bit. And verse number 9 says, and God said, let the waters upon the heaven be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas, and God saw that it was good. Okay, so we see the waters are divided, it's the land and the earth and things like that. But going on to verse number 11. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, and herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit upon his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. Okay, so it says in verse number 12, and the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself and after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. Okay, so very important for us to understand why I think that this is not a thousands of years, millions of years. There's not a gap between the days. It's called the gap theory. Now, there's been Christians over the years that have proposed and say, well, the gaps are really millions of years, or the gaps are thousands of years, or something like that. Okay, well, I don't know if any of you have taken, science classes and things like that, but a lot of plants will use something called photosynthesis. And that's how they obtain their energy. And without photosynthesis, the majority of plants and things like that will die. Now, I know that there are some funguses and things like that don't need light or whatever, but the majority of things, especially fruit-yielding plants, grasses, things like that, they need to have light. Well, my question to you is, if there's millions of years there before God creates the sun, how are these things getting nutrients? Because in day 4, God's going to create those things. And I'm already getting ahead of myself there. We won't really have time to dig into that question too much there. But again, I believe that this is literal days, because again, in 24 hours, plants are not going to die. Okay, plants will have the ability to go off the nutrients and things that God gave to them, and then the next day, God's going to make the sun. Okay, so it does make sense that this is a literal day, 24 hours, that God is making this timeline. Because otherwise, these plants would have all died between day 3 and day 4, if there was millions of years or thousands of years. They can't survive. Okay, plus there'd be nothing for the animals to eat on the following days if these things all died between there, and then let's say their seeds suddenly grew during that millions of years or something like that. So again, the book of Genesis gives us a very quick creation story. It's not a long, drawn-out story. And again, yes, there are groups of people that will say we can kind of incorporate an intelligent designer with the Genesis account or something like that. But I would argue that you really can't. I mean, I do think that intelligent design is a little bit more honest of a solution, I guess a little bit honest of an answer, even if you're not willing to acknowledge the God of the Bible. But I would say that the creation account pretty much needs to be taken at face value, or else, honestly, we don't know where we came from at all, because evolution really can't be true in the sense of how it is presented either. So I think that, again, there's good evidence to believe that the Genesis account is true. But again, looking here at these verses as we've read them, a very important concept for us to understand. It's mentioned in verses 11 and 12, both of them. It says, after his kind. Okay, so verse number 11 talks about the grasses and things like that. It says, the herb yielding seed, the fruit tree after its kind. Okay, so very important to understand. Okay, so what is a kind? Okay, so the scientists have come together and come up with a way to classify things. By the way, this is a very American way of looking at things. Okay, so Americans like to name everything. We have a name for all these things. Okay, so, just thinking about the Spanish language, I'm fluent in Spanish, we call a poplar, we call an aspen, and we call a cottonwood. Okay, in the Spanish language, the same word, an álamo, is used to describe all of those different types of trees. I don't personally think a poplar and a cottonwood or an aspen really have anything to do with each other than the fact that they're trees. But in the Spanish language, it's classified as a similar family or similar group. And maybe there's a botanist here or something that would tell me that they are somewhat more related than other trees. I don't know. But just as a way of looking at it, it's very much a cultural way of describing things. And scientists have come up with a lingo. And you know what? Christians have a lingo too. We'll say different things talking about, did you get saved? And if you're talking to somebody that doesn't know about the Bible, they'll be like, get saved? What are you talking about? Get saved. Did you get born again? They'd be like, Nicodemus, they'd be like, born again? What are you talking about? So they don't know our lingo that we use. And in the same way, scientists have kind of come up with a way to describe and classify everything, whether it's a plant or animal or whatever. They'll call it by their kingdom and phylum and class and all of these different things. And they'll get down to their species level and everything. But for God, how he classifies things is probably going to be different than how a scientist would. Or if you and I were to classify things. I don't know that I would agree with where they put a platypus. I mean, is that a mammal? I mean, it's got, it lays eggs and it's got little talons that inject venom. I don't know. But scientists had to figure out where it goes, and that's how they classify it, right? So, there's animals out there that kind of overlap. Evolutionists will mock, the Bible because God lumps bats with the fowl of the air. Okay, that's not necessarily how I would have classified it, but that's how the Bible classifies bats. Now, I understand that the mammals, and I understand that that's how our modern classification system takes priority there, but how the Bible looks at it, it's the flying fowls of the air. That's where God lumps the kinds of things. Now, again, we're not trying to say that everything is intricately related by family and things like that, but at the same time, there are kinds of things. Okay, there are kinds of dogs. But if you look at a poodle or a dachshund or a cocker spaniel, they're all dogs. Okay, yes, they're very different. They all look different, but they're at the end of the day, they're dogs. Okay, so we have different types of things that are similarly related. Okay, so how God classifies kinds might be different than how you and I, or a scientist, would classify them. Okay, but the thing is that they're going to be after their kind. Okay, and that's how God describes these things. It's not necessarily after its species. And that's where a lot of evolutionists will kind of try to poke holes and make fun of the Bible and make fun of, God, say, well, that's a different species, or that's a this and that. Well, okay, maybe it is by the classification system that a lost person came up with to describe the world around them. But just because you use a different classification system doesn't make it wrong. In the same way, I can look at things that I culturally believe. That doesn't make me right. It doesn't make me better than somebody that doesn't believe the same things, or look at things, or cook the same way, or prefer the same kind of music that I prefer. Other people have different values in other countries, and they might be perfectly fine to live by those values. It doesn't make them wrong and me right, or vice versa. Okay, in the same way, I think that Americans especially will read culturally scientific things because we've been so influenced by the education system, and especially a lost education system that does not prioritize God. They're trying to come up with a natural viewpoint of where everything came from. And by the way, it takes just as much, if not more, faith to believe in the Big Bang as it does to say, okay, this all happened by something supernatural. It could not have happened naturally. Because we have never witnessed those things about the Big Bang. We've never witnessed macroevolution. And again, one of the reasons why I would say it's very important for Christians to really ask, how old is the universe? How old is the earth? Because, again, that's one of the things the evolutionists will look at and say, well, if you give it a few more million years, you give it 1 billion years, it'll turn into something else. Unfortunately, we've never witnessed that. And again, their argument really can't be disproven either, because they're saying, well, it takes so much time. Well, it's beyond the lifetime, or beyond many lifetimes of humans. We'll never be able to see that based on what their theory and hypothesis is. So again, for us to understand the kind of things, a certain kind of grass, or a certain kind of plant, or a certain kind of something, you and I might call it a name. But again, as I even talked about here, different languages call things different things. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's different. There might be similarities. It might be a totally different concept, a totally different idea. And that's something we need to understand. Our thoughts and our ways of describing things are not necessarily God's ways of describing things. But again, that pretty much wraps up the second and third day of creation there. And again, the important thing to understand is that, again, I don't believe that there would be a large gap of time here, as I said. But again, God does conclude that, saying that it's all it's good, the things that He's made, and that concluded the third day with verse 13 there. But we'll go ahead and have a time of prayer here, and let's just do some business with God here. And thank you for being the Creator, for making us how He made us, and for His love for us. We'll go to God in prayer here at this time.